So, like Jennifer said, I'm Jen Meyer. I just graduated from the Art Institute of Sacramento, Art Institute of California-Sacramento, I should say, with a graphic and web design bachelor's of science, with a concentration in web development. So I haven't been here because I had class always Tuesday nights, so it's really great to be here, and I have served on all three of the WordCamp Sacramento organizing committees. So I've been around, I just haven't been here. So when Jennifer texted me and asked me if I wanted to speak, I said, sure, that's really great, because then I can get to know you guys and you guys can get to know me a little bit. Now you'll be seeing my face a little bit more. So tonight we're going to take a look at CSS Grid, how it differs from Flexbox, and what that means for responsive design. Here's my little disclaimer. This is not intended to be instructional at all. This is definitely informational. I know there were a few people on the Meetup website who were a little concerned about not knowing what Flexbox is and not knowing what CSS Grid is. So this is really just to kind of let you know what it is, and then you can take it from there to decide if it's something that you want to really dig into, and I'll give you some resources. So this is, like I said, the WordPress Meetup. So how does this relate before we get too far into this? If you're building custom themes, this is really going to relate to you because you're actually building your style sheet. So, and then if you're actually purchasing a theme, you might find some themes where they've used CSS Grid, and so you'll know how to kind of adjust those for your needs. So it is applicable, but it's more design in nature tonight. So currently with CSS, the way we lay things out, as you know, we use floats, inline block, display table, absolute and relative positioning, and lots of math, okay? So those who don't like to do the math and don't want to have to figure out what percentage 15 is of like 75, then CSS Grids is really going to benefit you in that respect. So what is CSS Grid Layout? It's a two-dimensional system, meaning it can handle both columns and rows. So for those of you familiar with Flexbox, you'll know Flexbox can only handle one direction. So this kind of is the next evolution, if you will, of Flexbox. You're going to be working with a grid layout by applying CSS rules to both parent elements, which is your actual grid container, and your child elements, which then become your grid items. And when I first started learning Flexbox, one of the issues that I ran into is it wasn't supported by all the browsers. This was a couple years ago. So one thing I really wanted to go with it, wanted to look into was that as of March 2017, all browsers are supporting CSS Grid. So we don't really have that issue if this is something that you want to move forward with. Okay, so the basics of CSS Grid. You have tracks. Tracks are going to be your columns or your rows. Okay, so it can be either way. Your cells are your individual blocks of content. And I'll show you in my example, you get a little bit of a better idea of what I mean by that. And an area is a number of cells. So without getting too complicated and too far into the nitty-gritty, those are the basic elements that you need to know, the basic vocabulary for CSS Grid. So you have your tracks, your cells, and your areas. So, defining a grid. With a grid defined on the parent element, all direct children become grid items. So I just went over that a little while ago, but I wanted to make note of the name right there, Rachel Andrew. She is the CSS Grid guru. So if after this you really want to learn more about it, Google her. She has some really great books out there and some really great YouTube videos, like hour-long YouTube videos where she really gets into the nitty-gritty. So if this is something that you want to move forward with, definitely write her name down and look her up. So what we're going to be doing for our example is we're going to be building a 3x3 grid. Okay, so this is our starting right here. Obviously it's coming out side of the page, so I have 9 images. So first thing I'm going to do is build div ID grid, right? That's going to be my container. We were talking about the parent element. So I'll have my div ID grid, and then within that, I'm going to have 9 div classes that are holding each of my images. So my 9 div classes are then called cards. So as we move forward, you might see that pop up. So I want to let you know that my class is cards. So once we apply the display grid, it's not really going to do anything because we haven't told the browser how wide we want the columns and how tall we want the rows and all of that. So that's going to come next. But we have German Shepherds, so I want to kind of stop for a second. I have a German Shepherd. His name's Fox Mulder. So that's how we end up with German Shepherds. So that's what we're going to be dealing with to build our grid. That is not him, but he was super cute like that. I couldn't find any images of him that were this cute. No. So that's why we have German Shepherds. A little bit about me. And so you can use display grid or display inline grid. You'll see it both ways depending on what tutorial you're looking at. So next, we're going to use grid template columns and grid template rows to determine how wide we want our columns and how tall we want our rows. So as I said, we're going to do a 3x3 grid, so we end up with 9 images. So this was pretty simple to do. If you've ever tried to build a grid with CSS, you have to float your elements and clear floats, and it's just, it takes a minute. So this was super, super simple to do. So it's just grid template columns and grid template rows. So the next evolution would be putting a gap between your images. So that's done by doing grid gap. So you can do it at whatever height you want, but then that's what's going to give you your white space in the middle of your grid. So if you've ever done responsive web design, you know that you don't want to be hard coding your values. Like you don't want to use 500 pixels or whatever the value is. You really want to be using, for me, I use viewport width and viewport height. That's just where I kind of sit on that spectrum. Some people use percentages, it just kind of depends. So that's, if you look here now, we have our grid template columns. It's 1FR. FR stands for fraction. So what this is going to do for you is it's going to take a fraction of the available space. So essentially what I've done is I've told it column 1 and column 2 will take up half of my page, and column 3 is going to take up the other half of my page. So simple. You don't have to do any math to do that. You can do it in any kind of configuration that you want. You can do it with the rows, however you need to do this. This is just super basic how to get it done. One thing I did want to point out is I was experimenting with this. My grid became smaller when I started using the FR unit as opposed to hard coding my width. I don't know why that happened, but I did want to point that out. So if it happens to you guys, just know that I think that's one of the hiccups with using it, one of the downfalls. Yeah.
What is the FR unit?
It means fraction.
Oh.
So it's a fraction of the available space. So essentially, if we were to convert this to math, it would be 25, 25, and 50. So that's what happens. Anything else before I move on? Yes.
All I kept thinking when you said fraction is because some elements like that, especially like CSS rules, they inherit from the parent. So that could be the reason why it's.
I thought so too. So I played around with the width on the actual grid. I put a width on it, I should say. It still did the same thing. It made it smaller. So I have no idea. But then I was looking through some other examples that people had posted, and I noticed theirs were a little smaller too. So I think that's just inherent in using the fraction. So.
Okay.
Yes.
Could it be that the grid gap is actually part of the full?
I thought so too.
Fractions like push it or like they suck them up.
I thought so too, but I took the grid gap off, and it still was smaller.
Okay.
So there's something inherent in the way that it does the math for you that it just ends up being a little smaller. So I could have, played around with it a little bit more to make it the size that I wanted it to, but I wanted to leave it true to my example so that you could actually see that that's what happened as I was working my way through it. Anything else? Okay. So, how do CSS Grid and Flexbox differ? If you remember back in the beginning, I said Flexbox is 1 dimension and CSS Grid is 2 dimensions. This is a really great example or a graphic demonstrating that. Flexbox, generally, you can either do it in rows or columns, not both. I did get it to work for both, and it was a huge headache, and I have that example for you next, so you can kind of look at it and how much I struggled to make it work. With CSS Grid, you can do both. So maybe it'll be better. I don't know. I need to try it out. So here's my experience with Flexbox. This is a version of my portfolio site that I did a few years back, and I thought it would be so interesting and amazing to have this really cool grid in the middle of my page, and you hover over, let's see if I can, I don't know where the thing is, there it is. If you hover over these blue boxes, you get this text, and then if you hover over these boxes right here, then they kind of flip, and then they change color and more text. Oh my God, it was crazy. So I decided to use Flexbox to try and make this work. And it worked really, really well for laying out the grid. Where I ran into problems was specifying what element I wanted those changes to happen on. That was a nightmare, and that's where Flexbox kind of lost me, and I eventually got it to work, but I think I lost 10 years off my life. So that's kind of, that was kind of it for me with Flexbox. And just to kind of give you an example of how I had to build this with Flexbox, I had 2 rows, and then if we take the bottom row, then I had 2 columns, and then within this column right here, I then had another 2 columns, and then I had to build 2 rows over here. I mean, it just went on and on and on. So you can see how I would end up with that specificity issue when I was trying to apply those micro interactions. So then I thought, okay, if I were to go ahead and do this in CSS Grid, what would that look like? And that kind of gave me even more of a headache. So this is essentially how I would do it in CSS Grid. I didn't go that far with this because my brain started to hurt, and I'm not entirely sure that this is a direction that I want to go in, but yeah, so this is what it would look like. I would have to span multiple columns and come down on my grid rows, and I mean, it just gets even more complicated. So I wanted to give you that flip side of that, because I don't know if that really makes things any easier. So what does this all have to do with responsive design? Okay, this is where I see CSS Grid really surpassing any of the alternatives. When I design a page, I generally go with a 3-column layout. So then, I have 3 columns for my desktop, and then I have 2 for like my tablet, and then 1 for my mobile. This could really come in handy. CSS Grid can really come in handy for responsive design, because you just do the 3FR, the 2FR, and the 1FR. So it can really kind of make that a little bit simpler. I could foresee less media queries and really just an easier time getting things done. But essentially, it's all variations on a theme, whether you use FR or you're using VW or you're using pixels. It's all, or percentages. It's all variations on a theme. It's what works best for you, which is the reason why I really wanted to present this to you as informational and not so much instructional, because this might not work for everybody. But this is something new that's out there. It's a newer iteration, if you will, of Flexbox, and I kept hearing this keyword, CSS Grid. What does this mean? What does this mean? So I really wanted to take the time to kind of dig into it as much as I could and see if it was worth learning. So it might be easier for more complicated layouts, but as you saw the diagram for my big grid, I don't know that that would be easier. I don't know if there's really any easier way to handle that. But I'm not sure about with a standard 3-column grid whether I would invest the time in learning this, because I'm pretty efficient the way I work right now. So yeah. really all I have for you guys. That went really fast. Any questions?
So when I looked at CSS Grid before, it looks like media query, like a media query nightmare for shrinking it down. Otherwise, you're just going to have like that really awesome looking design for desktop, and then you shrink it down to anything smaller than that, and now you're like all that complexity and multiply it by 3 or whatever the magnitude is.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. I don't know that it saves any time. I was telling Bill earlier, when I took the time to learn SAS, I saw like the lights and the heavens opened. I was like, this is going to save me so much time. But as I'm going through this, I don't know that this is going to save me any time. I don't know. So I think that it has potential. I have one of my websites that I actually want to revisit with this, where I have like a background grid, and then I had to position elements on top of that, and it got really complicated and convoluted. So I kind of want to take this and use the grid for my background elements, and then use absolute and relative positioning on top of that to see if maybe that worked. So it's just something I need to play with a little bit more. This is really just kind of like an introduction.
Did you like work with media queries even a little bit with it?
I looked into it,
Like,
but I
is it
haven't.
as scary as I think it is?
I think media queries are scary to begin with. You know what I mean? So for me, but I think that if you set up your fractions correctly, and you kind of have to work within the guidelines, then it should be okay. I mean, if you have too many media queries at the end, you have an issue with the way you set up your page anyway. So, it's not perfect. I will be the first to admit it's not perfect. It's not the answer to all of my questions, and not the solution to every one of my problems, but I do see potential.
Yeah, I have a comment if you have time.
Yeah.
So I hear that too, like when people are talking about it, and I can't tell if it's because it's new, and so like we're supposed to use it, but I'm just looking at it like, well, what, all these frame, bootstrap, and foundation and everything else, they've solved that problem like 5 years ago. So is this a day late and $1 short? That's what's going through my mind. Like we can do those layouts already. And I'm like, well, people are used to reading in these columns and the sidebars and whatever. So we have like the human element of what's comfortable for us to read. Like we can't just do craziness all the time.
Yeah, I don't really think like that this is the solution for just a standard web page. I think this is a solution for a specific portion where you want to have more of a complicated grid. Like the example that I showed you.
Yes,
I think it
like
would
that.
really work well for that once you really like dig into it. Way better than Flexbox. I mean, Flexbox was a nightmare. I can't even tell you. I haven't touched it since. I mean, that's how much it like damaged me. But yeah, I mean, it's just something, myself included, I really need to dig into it a little bit more.
Do you have examples of sites that use CSS Grid?
Of course.
You can show
but
us?
the internet's not
See.
working for me. I can pull some up. I'll post them.
They do have a public network if you're able to
Oh, okay.
connect.
I'm not able to.
Yeah,
it just popped up.
I
It's
haven't
like
been
it's
able to.
not, it just now came up, so you could try it.
Okay.
Maybe it was haunted.
I don't know. I think my whole computer's haunted.
Conversations that I had with people about CSS Grid is like, you can achieve that stuff without having to learn that, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
like, our conversations were, well, we can do that already.
Mm-hmm.
So do you really want to look at spending all of that time to learn another solution to try to do it a different way? I think CSS Grid will become a big solution for people who don't already know how to do those layouts, because it'll make it easier for them to do those layouts without having to learn all the code behind doing it by hand or doing it with other options. So I don't know how much you're going to see advanced developers take on something like CSS Grid, but designers who aren't already super code savvy, I think will be the ones that will take on something like CSS Grid, because it will help them create those more complicated layouts without having to write as much code. I think it'll be a little bit messier on the back end, but I think that's where you're going to see the divide. Is it's going to be more of a designer solution than like an advanced.
I think you can move like or position HTML elements. Say it appears at the bottom of your HTML file. You can now position that at the top. So I think there's SEO, I don't know, benefits. Now you can place your footer information at the very top. I don't know why you would, but just theoretically you could place that at the top and then position it with grid at the bottom, like it's where it's supposed to appear, but it's higher and like, I don't know, I don't know, like it's Google SEO black magic stuff, but like you can do that. I think that would be advantageous to be able, I mean, at least have the option to do it.
There is actually an advantage to going to grid from like a Bootstrap because you don't have that extra dependency and all that code you don't need. One of the things that kept me out of Bootstrap for so long is like the overwhelming like bulk of class names that someone else wrote that I don't know.
See, I don't use
So
Bootstrap.
you can actually,
I don't do
with
it.
grid, you're actually removing all of your need for wrapper divs and all these extraneous classes, so you're having much cleaner content that can be repurposed into AMP pages and other, you know, feeder type non-device dependent type layouts. So I don't think that the media query thing is actually an issue. A lot of it's built into the native behavior of the grid. So there are some advantages to it. It's, like you said, it takes looking into it a little bit deeper.
And I think it's also project specific. I don't see this working for every project. And like Jennifer said, for someone, like for me, I don't use, like I was telling Aaron, I don't use Bootstrap. I code from scratch because I feel like it takes me 3 times as long to go over somebody else's code and make it do what I want it to do.
Just to strip out all the crap that you don't need.
Exactly.
Like, you start from a super simple, you know, clean starter that we built.
So I agree with her because I'm not a developer, I'm a designer. And I specialize in instructional design, so when I'm taking course content and I want it to be viewable on a tablet or mobile device, this is perfect for me because I hate code.
Yeah.
So I don't think that way, I think visually. And so to be able to kind of translate and see grid as a designer, it's like translating the language, so it makes it easier for me, which is why I came to this event. I was like, ooh, my life is gonna be easy.
It does. There are some advantages, yeah. For a simple layout like that, for me, I think it would take me longer to use this. So I think it just all depends on where you're at. But like Jennifer was saying, if you're new to it, this would really come in handy. So definitely.
My designer friends that are not developers love this.
Yeah.
Like love.
Which is I think why I'm on the fence. I don't know. Because it seems like it might be a little bit more work for me than I currently do. So
You're a very strange evangelist.
well, you know, I'm not here to sell you on it. I'm here just to kind of let you know what I found out. You know, fully honest.
One question on the compatibility. I had read that Microsoft doesn't really support it as well as one would like.
It's Microsoft. What do you want?
Yeah.
Okay. It sounded like IE 10, 11, and Edge have their own variant, which is quite different and not fully compatible. Okay.
You know, my sense is that a lot of web layout is pretty, what we call web layout is pretty fundamental, and for the designers in the room, pretty limiting, you know, compared to what we've been able to do with layout in print for a long time in terms of grids and complex grids. But my sense with this is like your diagram of your page with your crazy grid. Like, if you're going to use CSS grids, you're going to have to do that kind of planning for your page. And unless you're building something that requires that kind of planning, then you're probably not going to need it or use it. But it could help us get away from sort of, you know, the wedding invitationification of the web where everything's just kind of centered.
Which is how I design too, as you know. I like to break my grid and cross my columns and layer my elements. So that's why this was kind of appealing to me.
Just a quick comment on like inspecting a grid like this. Firefox has a really nice inspector built in now that can kind of dissect all this.
So yeah, no, I'm not a great evangelist for this. It really was just kind of what I found. It was just an excuse to really dig into it as much as I could, and you know, I kept hearing these keywords, and so I wanted to kind of look into it and see. So I don't know. Like I told you, I have one project that I think I'm going to revisit with it and see if it helps.
You had the 3 elements up there. Slide back. Is that the page resizes? Does the grid? Do you have to go in with queries to allow items to reflow from
So-
like a
So this is
horizontal
Flex.
layout to a.
So this
I
is
know this is Flexbox,
yeah.
but you had like your first example of the dog pictures of the
Uh-huh,
dogs.
yeah.
As that shrinks.
Oh,
is
okay.
that going to reflow into like a single column or dual column?
Yeah. So
or-
if you, it depends on how you set it up. So I would set it up. Let me
or
back
can
to
you,
that.
do you do that just in the grids, or do you have to go into the
You would have to do a
media
media query.
Okay.
Yeah. So I would take it from a 3-column to a 2-column and say how many fractions I want that to span. So you still have to do that. Thank you. Yes, you still have to do media queries so that it goes to the 3 different sizes. But sometimes I find that I'm doing multiple media queries at like wonky sizes because my content just isn't flowing correctly. So I see the potential for this to maybe make that a little easier, not have to do as many media queries. But then again, I think you'll just end up with a simple layout. I don't think you're gonna be able to do anything too complex to do that. But yes, you do need media queries.
One more question. As the size shrinks, I notice you've got the row size as a fixed
I would put that as a
number.
fraction too.
Okay. I didn't know it would shrink.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. 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 All of it would be a fraction or a percentage. And the thing with this is you can also mix your units. You can mix fractions with percentages, or even put pixels in there. So it can make that adjustment. Like if I wanted one of the columns to always be 250 pixels no matter what I did with everything else, I could do that too. So you can kind of mix and match.
Like you said you have more of a designer pedigree, right? So, do any of the tools that you use offer to output that CSS and grid? Like, you know how you can select some elements in, I don't know, XD or something, you can say like, give me the CSS for this to position it.
I've never done anything like that because I do code. So I do both. So I've never like had something output my code for me. I've always done it from scratch. So that I don't know. Sorry.
Nice.
There's some things like that for social media, like if you want, like say you want your Instagram photos to show up on your site, there's a couple of places where I've used, and I just go and it does it for me. I just copy and paste the code into my site, and then it does all the magic for me.
You're talking about actually designing in a design software,
Yeah,
correct?
like
Yeah.
sometimes Sketch or XD or
Yeah.
something. It will definitely output the CSS for you, but I don't know if Grid is too new to be in those tools.
Yeah, that I don't know because like I said, I've never used that before. Yeah.
CSS Grid.
They just upgraded everything to 2018 too, so it could be in the new run stuff.
If any, the one I would guess that would be InVision.
Yeah.
That would be the one I would guess would probably adopt that first, but I don't know of any that any design software that would write this yet. I don't know if they would invest the time in it writing that until it's widely adopted.
Plus, it seems like opinionated that the Sketch or whatever would assume that you want it in Grid versus flows versus anything else.
Right.
So if it did offer it in Grid, it would probably also have to offer it in Float and Flexbox and everything else at the same time, which is like also more work. And I don't know.
I don't know. I don't have the answer to that one. Yeah. In any case, this is what I found.
Any other questions?
So, if you're going to use Grid, you don't have to like make your entire layout grid based, right? Like you could say, okay, well inside this one div, I want to use the grid, but still utilize whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So you would just inside that div, you would just do display grid,
Okay.
and so it would just affect that parent element.
Okay.
I did find a CSS Grid Builder website. So like it's like a web app as opposed to like an app. I don't know how reliable or clean
I
it
don't
is
trust
though.
that.
Yeah, which is probably how I would actually use it if I ever decided to use it for more complicated portions of my site where I actually had like a true grid. If I were just, like I said, doing 3 columns or 4 columns or however I wanted to separate it, I'd probably honestly just use input width.
Yeah, I think the main benefit would be like if you were to make a responsive website, but like you didn't want your sidebar to get folded in, flow of the content. So instead of like hiding your sidebar completely and having it reappear in a media query, like having it in two different places. I don't know if I'm making any sense. So if you have like a display none for a large screen,
Right.
On your on the content that's below your content, have a display none for a wide screen. Mobile, you do display inherit or something to make it appear, but you might actually have that content in two different areas. If you wanted it to like kind of completely break the flow of, like say you wanted like content that like would normally live in your sidebar, instead of pushing it down below, maybe for mobile you want it to appear above, or before the actual body content. So when everything's collapsed, I think that Grid would allow you to like completely change how that flow appears.
Well, I mean, you can do that with media query. So, that's not something that is just something that you would be able to only be able to do with CSS Grid. I mean, that would be a media query.
Both Flexbox and Grid have been, that's a big feature of both of those pieces. I mean, I know so much about Grid, but Flexbox in particular is, designed so you don't have to have multiple copies of your source code or your elements. You can actually choose where you want them to display. And I believe that that's true for Grid as well. You have control over where elements are displayed.
Yeah, it's kind of an extreme example, but say maybe you want to push a sidebar content up into the header of your website, so it's not just in the body
You gave with
area.
you gave footer moving, and it's a perfect example of what you're talking about.
He was talking about the SEO.
Categories are sitting in your sidebar, and you want them to kick up to your header instead if they're on a phone, so that you don't lose that sidebar content.
Yeah.
Something like that, I can see that it would work well. But another simple way can be done.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of potential. There is a lot of potential. There's so much information out there. I'm gonna dig into it some more. I'm gonna apply it to some of my current projects and see if it would have made them any easier. It's worth a shot, but I don't know. Jury's still out.
I think it's worth noting that it's not like there's one right way or one right tool, right? So if you're a designer and you're not a developer, and this lets you look at it visually and helps you create the code for what you're creating, then it's a good solution, right? So, I mean, it's not, you look at things like CMP2 versus advanced custom fields. Doesn't matter which one you use, it gets the same job done. Flexbox, CSS Grid, any other, compiler that helps you build those visual layouts and write code. It's all going to come down to personal preference and what you think is the easiest for you. And that's one of the great things about having these kind of talks at the meetup, is that you get to see what else is available, right? So decide if that's something that you want to take a look at. Any other questions, comments, things to share?
So you mentioned Rachel Andrew, right? Any other authors or even like sites you would recommend?
Honestly, no, because everybody was just copying her content. In all honesty, yeah, I would go straight to the source.
Okay.
Yeah.